Thanks to everyone for dropping your answers in the Q&A. We'll keep posting them if you want to keep adding them throughout the session. And these are all really great things to talk about. And so, by the way, we just started the recording. And so now we're going to go on to the questions portion. So I'm going to start with a question that feels maybe kind of basic, but I think is very layered and interesting. And I want to start with Hadassah. And can you just start with what investing means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, this question ties so deeply into the exercise that we just did. So when I'm working with clients, when I'm doing workshops with people, and they say, I want to know about investing, one of the things I always like to start with is why. And I like to break down that why into a couple of questions to start to figure out what investing means to you. I want to think about who you're investing for, when you're investing for, and the purpose of investing. And often we don't make these implicit elements explicit. So it can be really, really helpful when you're thinking about investing to start to make those explicit. Am I investing for myself so that I can have money in the future? Okay. That's totally fine. That's might be what you might normally assume with investing, but there are so many other types of things that we can get investing to do, but we have to start to ask ourselves these questions about, well, what is investing and what does it mean to me? Am I investing for myself for the short term? Am I investing for the planet and the long term, right? What am I thinking about when I'm thinking about investing? Am I thinking about investing in community in the short term? And when we start to articulate those things for ourselves, it starts to become a little bit more nuanced, and we get to make better and more values aligned plans when we're talking about what we're investing for. Often when we use the term investing, we talk about this idea of returns. So a return is, what are you hoping to get back out of investing? And again, we often assume that that's like a financial return. That's sort of the implicit assumption in investing, but it doesn't have to be so. We can also think about social returns, environmental returns. We can start to get a little bit more complex and nuanced in what we're trying to get back out of investing. We can certainly dig into some of this nuance throughout the call. I know that we will, but I want to frame us up to start thinking about the different types of returns that we can go into thinking about our investments that we're trying to get, because that's going to drive the type of investments that you put your money into. That's going to drive how you start to think about how you're going to split up the money that you have available to invest, how you might delegate and allocate your portfolio. So start putting this in your percolator. What are you hoping, what returns, what types of returns are you hoping to get out of your investments? And then to go back to the exercise that we just did, what values do you have? It's a question I often give people ahead of time before we work together in workshops and in coaching, because it's a hard question to answer. And that's why we gave it to you all in this session, because we often I find with myself for sure, walk around being like, I'm values driven. Okay, great. What does that mean? Which values am I driven by? And asking ourselves to articulate those values also helps us start to get more specific, especially when we're thinking about something like investing. We're all going to have a lot more success, and you're going to learn about this over the workshop today, when we have a specific value or set of values we're thinking about, in finding investments that help you drive those values forward. It's a lot harder to say, I want to do good, and then try to figure that out. It's a lot easier for yourself to find the thing that you want to do if you say, I want to do good for the planet in the short term. I want to do good for women-owned, LGBTQ-owned, and people of color-owned businesses in the long term. Okay, great. The more specific that you can get, the more able you are to get in there and drive that impact. So when I'm thinking about what investing means, I'm really thinking about being as detailed as possible about thinking about what it is I'm actually trying to get out of investing. And just to restate, it is okay to say, I'm trying to make sure I have money, when I retire. That's totally okay. You can still also apply thinking about values to that lens and that need that you have. It's just also going to be one of the delimiters when you're thinking about, well, great, then what types of investments am I going to make? Because it's also okay to say, you know what, I've got some money or some resources that I don't need now, or even necessarily in the long term. And I'm going to put that into investing that gives me social or environmental returns. I'm less focused on the financial returns for this particular pot of money. That's going to give you a whole other set of potential investments for you to make. But you have to start by saying, well, what am I trying to do? What's the outcome I'm looking for? And what matters to me along the way? And I'm curious what my colleagues here on the call would add to that.
I would definitely like to add to that. Once you start thinking about, yourself and putting yourself in the situation so that you can take this whole complex idea and break it down to you and how it affects you on an individual level, then you can start to think a little broader about who else do we need to be in alignment with. So Hadassah, you were mentioning like the members of the LGBTQ plus community, BIPOC community, just women entrepreneurs. You start thinking about who is this investment going to affect? Who is it including? Who is it excluding? So in a traditional sense, in finance, we can look at a macro level, right? We look at all of the different things that go into building a portfolio that's resilient over time. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, it can be a bit exploitative of people, of planet. And then we start to say, I don't want that. And then again, to Hadassah's point, you start figuring out what do you do? Who do you want to include? And what are you looking to get out of it? And for us at RSF, it's all about, we want to be a part of that change that we want to see. So are we going to invest in a company that's heavily using fossil fuels? Absolutely not. And that's totally, counter to the values that we've set forth and made very plain to everyone. So once we individually figure out what we value, what change we want to see, then we can definitely start taking steps towards that.
And I think this is something, we've been talking a lot with kind of our first customers in this space, and many of these people have already identified that, climate and the environment are so, one of the most important things to them. They already have changed their career, they've changed their lifestyle, they've done so many different things that are actually extremely difficult to do, right? We've met people who have children and gave up all plastics, right? Like that is very difficult, right? Like you've done the hard work, but then haven't thought about how their values could be incorporated into their finances. So to me, this is like the next untapped area for people who have identified what's very important to them to start digging into that and figuring out what they can do, because these actions do add up. They do make a difference. When companies are pressured to change their behavior, they do change their behavior. We haven't, gotten consumers and the average retail investor kind of organized around this idea. It's just kind of starting to become a common thing to start thinking about this. And that's why I'm so glad we're having this panel today, just to kind of spur people to start thinking about how they can start using their money in a way that builds the world that, they want to see for themselves and their children in the future.
Yeah. And Bonnie, that sort of leads into my next question, which is like, so ESG and impact investing, it started as this sort of smaller idea. It's becoming more popular and more mainstream. And I'm wondering, and I'm just going to break it down for everyone in the webinar. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So it's a way for investors to increasingly apply factors that are not just financial to their investment decisions. And Bonnie, I'm wondering if you can start by just talking about what you think the biggest challenge with ESG investing is as it becomes more popular and more of interest to more investors.
For me, the biggest challenge for ESG is at its base, it was never designed for the average consumer. It also doesn't actually have one definition. There's no government entity saying this is what ESG is. It has there's no one policing these different metrics. They often have essentially contradictory goals. Like, one thing might be good for the environment, but very bad from like a social point of view. It puts the consumer in a very difficult space because since you can define it any way you want, you can, and they are, financial metrics by entities who are paid to create these financial metrics, they can be easily influenced so that certain companies are included or excluded from an ESG fund. And many people don't realize that since they're done on an industry basis, often you could get an environmental fund that contains fossil fuel companies, because some fossil fuel companies are quote unquote better. Well, some are better, but they're still fossil fuel companies. They shouldn't be in a fund that touts itself as being environmentally friendly. If you go and look at like Google climate leaders, right? It's like they have a list on Google Finance. You'll see cement companies and chemical companies and all sorts of things that while it's certainly an important part of our economy, and maybe you want those things in your portfolio, maybe you don't if your goal and your values are climate environmentally focused. So I think it's very easy for the average investor to be misled simply because these were never meant to be something. They're internal institutional metrics that have been repurposed to charge the consumer a higher fee structure. And I think it's really unfortunate that we find ourselves in a place where people are trying to put their money to do the right thing and end up essentially being kind of tricked into investing in companies that may not meet their values and their priorities. So that's one thing, we are from the bottom up trying to be climate focused and trying to help people to parse through all these ESG metrics and just like get to the truth. Like, is it good for the environment or not? Is it carbon intensive or not? Like, can we just like actually get to the base of what matters here from a climate perspective? And so, yeah, we're excited to add that transparency to the consumer so they can actually just see what they're invested in for once.
And it's just so important what you're doing, Bonnie, because I find, and again, I work entirely with like progressive folks and people who are very values driven. And so there's often a sense of kind of inherent distrust or suspicion in financial systems based on people's lived experiences and observations on systemically how our economic systems and major players within those have contributed to exploitation of people and decimation of the planet, right? And so if you combine that suspicion with kind of confusing financial product, or like you use the word being tricked, people feel that they might be being tricked. Mm-hmm. They're concerned that they're going to be misled for good reason based on their experiences and what they've observed, and then find out, or like kind of feel even worse because they're like, oh my goodness, I have been misled, or like now we're hearing like, oh, is this product greenwashed, right? Like, is there something that like says that it's more climate friendly than it actually is? And people, if we trust that people are smart, just like want information and give them information, there's still, all like the sort of like behavior change stuff to kind of work with, but just getting people the basic information, it has been so hard. And the nuance is hard to communicate. I know when I'm working with clients, I'm like, well, sometimes you're going to see an ESG fund and it's going to have Pepsi Cola in it because they score well on the social criteria, and banks score well on governance criteria because they hire and promote a lot of women. And like, it's complicated, I think, to give people that nuance. And then also from consumer points of view, people who want to both get financial returns as well as environmental and social returns are looking for products that are more affordable, might not be in a position to like afford a financial advisor, right? Someone to actually like build a portfolio for them. And so therefore are looking at index funds and like ETF funds that use some of these more algorithmic criteria that then make that then kind of trigger all of this like nuance stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, it is very complicated out there, honestly. And it has been interesting being on this journey, building this product. From the beginning, our goal has always just been to provide our users, our consumers with data that they're asking for. And as we started talking to we actually talked to almost all of the different data providers out there, and almost all of them said that we could not directly show underlying climate metrics to consumers. It was like something they were unwilling to write into a licensing agreement for. And to me, that's just kind of dumbfounding. It's public information. It's in public reports. It's not like, they're just getting it from reading financial reports largely. And nonetheless, they didn't want to provide it to us so that we could give it to the end consumer. And this is just, I think, because they know it benefits them, and it's really frustrating because I think everyone deserves at least the information. They have the right to know what they're investing in, and then make an informed choice. If you look at the data and you're like, you know what, this isn't for me, it's not diversified enough, blah, blah, blah. Perfect. That's great. I am so happy you've been able to make an informed decision. But I at least want to get to the point where everyone has the data about their own money and its impacts, and then they can, reallocate or not as they so choose.
And Bonnie, when you talk about data, like, I feel like there's so many data points that people could consider when they're thinking about their investments, and so many factors. And I'm wondering, so how people can sort of move from, okay, like, I have all this information, and that can sometimes feel overwhelming in and of itself. Like, how do we help people move from like having access to all this information? And Erica, I see you're nodding your head too. You might have a thought on this, like having all of this information and then actually making the decision about where to put their money.
I think it goes right back to your first question and what Hadassah was saying, with like, define your values first, define your goals. And then once those are well defined, it makes it easier to then make informed decisions. If you're not quite sure what you want your goals of your money to be, whether it is retirement or a second house or climate, it's going to be very hard to then reallocate and choose different providers. But on the other hand, you can make simpler choices too. Like, if you're with Chase Bank, they're pretty bad. They're the #1 funder of fossil fuels in the world. Like, if there is a project happening in like the Arctic, it's probably JP Morgan Chase that has actually funded it, right? It's not going to change your retirement strategy if you leave JP Morgan Chase and go to Clean Energy Credit Union or Atmos, or a bank that actually takes your deposits and does something positive with them. So there are many smaller decisions you could make, or only deal with a smaller percentage of your portfolio. Most people's portfolio is not like 100% bad. It's usually a very small percentage that they can reallocate and change. And so to me, that's, start thinking of this as something you can do in smaller chunks. You're not like totally redoing your entire life. But there are ways that you can start to really make a difference once you actually have some of the data in front of you.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that, yeah, you don't want to have analysis paralysis where you have too much data and too much things to think about. It becomes too complex and overwhelming and you do nothing. So again, back to where we started of trying to figure out where your head's at, where are you trying to take this? What change are you trying to see? And then do some smaller things so that you're at least moving the needle personally, so that you know that your actions that you're responsible for are moving, that they are in alignment with what you want to see in the future. So again, using that analogy of, I need to retire, and I need to build up that emergency reserves, and now you're starting to look at return differently, right? How much return do I get for the money that I'm putting aside now? But then you don't stop there. And then you say, okay, now how is that return being earned? Who is it impacting? So just take it one step further instead of 100 steps further.
That reminds me of this quote that I really love. That's like, you don't have to do everything, just do something. Like that, not getting tripped up on being perfect or doing everything correctly, but just take those small steps, and then it's all going to feel a lot easier. And I know that something that often feels intertwined for people is sort of like the money that how much they should be investing and committing to sort of impact investing opportunities that are aligned with their values out of their entire budget, alongside like how much should people be donating to causes or people who they care about. I'm wondering if, Erica, you could start us off by helping people figure out how to think about that.
Absolutely. So for those of us who have made it to a point in their lives where we can start to think about philanthropy, or as we like to call it, donor activism, and start thinking about how you can pair that capital that you've set aside, whether it's 10%, 20%, however much you've decided that you want to donate, and then go along with how much you want to invest. And they should be aligned. In my opinion, they should be aligned, because then you can multiply your own impact, whether it's with a community-led development, or if it's an innovative social enterprise that's working to mitigate some systemic challenges that we're all facing, or ones that are truly pertinent to you. You just want to use both sets of capital, both pots of capital to double, triple, however you want to multiply that impact personally. So at RSF, we're sponsors of donor advised funds. So that's all philanthropic capital, right? And then we're sponsors of a social investment fund that's a revolving loan fund. And sometimes we have situations where we have an organization that isn't quite at the collateral level or the revenue level that we need them to be in order to take advantage of the loans. So then we kind of look towards our community of donors, that philanthropic capital, where we can start to think of maybe a recoverable grant is in order, or maybe some technical assistance. So we want to use this whole integrated capital approach to wrap ourselves around the entrepreneur and the community, to give them what they need, and based on what they say they need and what they've demonstrated is what they need, and not what we prescribe that they need. So that's how I would like for us to think about it, in terms of it working together, your own money, your own pots of money being in alignment with your values.
Yeah, that's great. And I wanted to also talk a little bit about like specific types of impact. So I know at Raise Green, we spend a lot of time trying to sort of quantify the impact to help people who are investing in the issuers on our platform, like understand what change they're making. Because I think a lot of times it can feel really nebulous, like I'm putting money into this thing and I think it's good, but like I don't really know how. So like we know that like one of our issuers, you know, the investments that they've raised have reduced emissions equivalent to $850,000 or 850,000 miles of car travel, which is like 34 laps around the earth, like helping people quantify fun things like that. I'm wondering how you all sort of quantify the impact of your work, or have helped your clients figure that out for themselves.
I'll touch on that a bit. I think this is something that the climate movement as a whole has truly struggled with, is helping people understand the scale of the problem, an individual's contribution, and then like all of these fun numbers behind it, right? Like, I don't think the average person has a really good grasp of you know, metric tons of CO2 equivalent. I don't think that pulls at a heartstring particularly. And similarly with, you know, carbon footprint, saying, you know, this was something we really dug into in the beginning, was like, what do you think about your carbon footprint? And it was a little bit like asking someone their like cholesterol levels. Like, you know, they're like, I know I have it somewhere, I don't really like to think about it. And so that's something that, you know, I think communication is really important. And one of the impacts we are really focused on at GreenPortfolio is trying to help everyone understand that, you know, it's been estimated by like Al Gore's investment fund that 40% of all global emissions come from publicly traded companies. So these are, so 40% of global emissions is from companies that we have some real potential direct influence over, right? As shareholders and as investors in general. And so that's one thing we really want people to understand is like, this is a lever you haven't been pulling that helps you to have an even bigger impact than you were having before. And when companies know that they're under scrutiny, when there are actions taken by shareholders to either encourage them to be cleaner, to get them removed from different investment vehicles if they are really emissions intensive, companies actually do clean up their act. Like this has been shown to be a fairly effective way of influencing publicly traded companies to behave better and to be better public actors when it comes to climate change. And to this point, like largely the consumer behavior moving out of a fund, divesting from a certain company because they don't like how they're acting, has largely been like not captured, right? So I don't think Chase knows generally when a customer leaves because of their climate activities, right? So that's one thing that we are really focused on, is trying to, through this kind of collective action, close this loop so that we can actually tell companies, we are paying attention, people are paying attention, they're moving their money because of how you're behaving, because it is not aligned with a sustainable earth we can all live on. Which, by the way, is really bad for your profits if you are funding activities that are going to make it such that your company can't really function in the future. It's very, so we think that there's actually a lot of impact an individual can have, and we want to make it even easier for them to understand how to have that impact, and then also communicate that so that it's not just like into the ether, so that we can pass that message on in a really effective manner.
So I'm just still really thinking about something like Erica said, and like Sophie, you touched on, but I'm vibing this whole conversation. But like Erica, so many good things, but the idea of like, so if some people are going to be at a place where you're able to articulate, okay, here's money I'm saving for retirement, here's money for my like emergency fund, other things, and I want to be able to double my impact, not just have a financial impact, but to have that social or environmental impact. And I think that's a really useful way to think about it, right? I mean, Bonnie's talking about it in terms of putting your money in a bank that matters a lot less, like, or that when we rephrase that, in a bank that does less harm, right? Like community banks, co-ops, credit unions, there's social impact banks. There are truly banks out there whose entire thing that they're looking to do is to help people and to improve what's happening on our planet. And you wouldn't know that if you've only ever interacted with big banks, but there really are, like smaller banks really are out on these streets trying to make positive change and help people. I say I went and worked in banking because I wanted to understand the mindset of banking. And so I was able to like come out with that major insight from myself. And Sophie, you said this thing about, just make a decision, right? Make a choice. And a framework I've been giving my clients, especially those who are kind of still formulating some of their goals, because often people are able to say, okay, well, I want some money for later when I'm older and I'm not working, and I want to have some sort of emergency padding for right now. And then there's something in the middle that feels more nebulous. Maybe I want to, I don't know, go back to school, fund college for my kid. I don't have kids yet. Do I want to figure out how to, like, there's a lot of, there can be a lot of question marks in life about what your financial goals are in that sort of medium term. So I always like to give people this concept of an opportunity fund. You want to be able to give yourself the opportunity to make a decision later. And I'm really vibing this idea of making that opportunity fund be something that does double work for you. Like, you don't just want it to give you a financial opportunity later. You also want it to be doing some work in the current, right? So whether that's keeping that money at a bank that is a better bank, whether that is investing that money in a shorter term, revolving loan fund, or putting it into a shorter term business investment, right, at like, you know, a raised green type place, or otherwise if you want to like put it into like a shorter term investment, or thinking about a stock market investment that you can put it into that you know, that you clear through GreenPortfolio, right? You actually take a look at that money, you can do more for you, and you don't have to necessarily have your whole plan laid out for it, for that money to have those multiplied returns. So I know that wasn't the question we're talking about, but I just want to give people that freedom that if you don't know your whole plan, it's okay. You can still do things with your money in the interim that tee you up and are doing good work in the short term.
And if I could just add that even at RSF, and when we have cash on hand, right? Because sometimes that cash needs to be readily available so that we can deploy to for loans. And we want to think about short-term money. Where do we want to put that? Do we want to just put it in any old bank? No, we don't. You know, we may even go as far as to just buy a CD, so let's say at a Native American bank, or, you know, just another CDFI where we know that in the short term, it is creating greater impact rather than just sitting cash in a savings account. And so when we're thinking about that on that level for the organization, we can certainly think about that on an individual level as well.
Yeah, I think those are all great. And so we had one question that is asking, like, this person says, lots of great information. If I'm just starting on impact investing today, what is one tip to just get started right now? And I know Hadassah, like, you named a couple of things. If everyone wants to just say, like, okay, what's the one thing that someone could do today?
Well, I don't want to, you know, steer anyone to our fund, but I know that, you know, for our social investment fund, like for $1,000, you can get, you know, all community-led, locally, you know, it's local across the country. So, so we have lots of wonderful, innovative social enterprises that we invest in, and the portfolio is around 80 private enterprises that you can invest in for as little as $1,000. And it's a 90-day note.
Awesome. Okay.
I always like to suggest that if you're just getting started, identify an amount of money that doesn't feel scary to you. So that could be $50, that could be $250, $1,000. You are the expert, whoever you are, right, on what a non-threatening amount of money, and move that money to an investment. Like, and this is getting over that analysis paralysis, and that's why it matters to have it be a non-scary amount of money. Because so often I see with my clients, I've certainly experienced with myself, kind of getting stuck in like feeling like you have to optimize, and that like the dollar that you put in has to be the best dollar, and you can't do anything wrong with it. And there's all sorts of behavioral like research and mindsets we can go into that we won't. It's better if you just kind of pull the Band-Aid off for yourself and put whatever it is, hypothetical $50 into a fund. You're going to learn so much by moving that money. You're going to be paying so much more attention. You're going to be looking around at that fund, at other funds. And it's a really great way to get yourself started. So yeah, everybody else on this panel has great things that you can get started at different price points. So it's also letting yourself, knowing that you're going to build over time, knowing it doesn't have to be perfect this first round, knowing, frankly, all of us are going to change and adjust and move and modify how we have our money set up over the course of our lives. So just getting something that you can do today is starting is how to get started, is really what I'm saying.
So I try very hard. I am not your financial advisor, nor am I trying to give anyone specific financial advice. So let me just throw that out there, because I'm not licensed to do so. My piece of advice, when I get this question from people a lot, and while your investment portfolio is something that can have the biggest impact, for people who are just starting, I really like to encourage them to, one, just write down where all your money is. Like just make a little spreadsheet, what bank it's at, approximate amount, what credit cards you have. A lot of people haven't done like that little bit of homework first. And I think that's a good starting point. And then I would look at like the financial product you're using the most. Like to me, that's a good place to start. Are you using a credit card the most, or are you a debit card person? Because though that might be a smaller amount of money, because you're interacting with it so frequently, it's going to feel really good if every time you use your debit card, it's at a bank that you know is doing good stuff with your money. And while that might feel like a very small action, I think it's a really good starting point. It's a good foundation to be like, I made one small change. I changed from one bank to another, that now when I'm using my money, it's doing the right thing. And I think it's a good, safe starting point to then start looking at your bigger accounts, the ones that are tied up in a 401k that you've been meaning to roll over forever, because then you're going to feel a little bit more empowered to be like, hey, that 401k I've been meaning to roll over, I can now roll it over to, there are actual climate focused impact investment IRAs you can roll over to now. Super cool. But, that takes a while to get to that point. So start with something small that's going to feel good every day. I think that's a way easier place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love all of these ideas again about like, you don't have to do everything, just do this small thing. Understand what you have, I love that idea that Hadassah said about pick an amount of money that's not scary to you, whether that's $50 or $1,000, and figure out how to sort of experiment with that money, whether it's like buying the RSF note or going on Raise Green and looking at or anything like that. I think that's a great way to sort of just, again, rip the Band-Aid off and figure out how you're already spending your money and like what you can shift just a little bit in a way that gets closer to how you want to be spending your money. And that is actually, so we had one person ask a question, how can I see the holdings of a green mutual fund or ETF? How do I know who does less harm? I think that's a really good basic skill. I'm wondering if anyone can just give a brief overview about like, if someone is like, I know that I'm invested in an ETF, but like, I have absolutely no idea what's in it. Like, how can someone go about figuring that out?
Okay, so this is like, we're building a company around this exact question. So I don't know if this was someone who's particular, I'd love to talk to you. We're looking for testers if this is something you're personally trying to do. So anyone can look up the holdings in an ETF. So you can start there. You can Google it. So if you Google the prospectus for the ETF you're concerned about, you can see what the different holdings are. They will break it down by industry, by how it's diversified across different countries, etc. Taking then that leap to figuring out then the climate impact or the ESG, the different ESG ratings for a fund, it's somewhat difficult. That's why we're trying to build a software that actually can do this for you. Exactly. So you can go to some of these other ESG ratings engines. So there's Morningstar has it within your bank. Like if you have Fidelity or Schwab, most of them, you can see how an ESG ratings company has rated that ETF. I would suggest if you're going to be doing this yourself, try to look at several different ones because they will have different answers and they have different opinions on what is, something that has a high ESG score. Personally, I'm pretty disillusioned with ESG, but it's still a very good place to start. And then hopefully once we're up and running, you can run all your finances through our tool and we'll give you a better analysis from a climate perspective of what that fund is doing. But right now it's pretty manual. You just kind of have to look at all the different resources you can find that are available to you and make an assessment for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's always such a good exercise, just because even if you're not necessarily looking at the ratings, just learning like what sort of might be in a portfolio that is rated as ESG and then figuring out how to decide, like, does that actually align with what you're interested in? Like, for example, if a fossil free portfolio still has these large companies that you don't agree with a lot of their practices, that might give you a lot of information about how to sort of interpret ESG ratings.
And once again, I'm sorry, just super fast. I'm not your financial advisor, but I think most people would be surprised if you're invested in a number of ESG funds that you might be like heavily weighted in Apple and like Facebook and whatnot, which not even from a like environmental perspective, maybe that's not what you want from like a diversification risk. So just figuring out what's in your funds is a good thing to do regardless of your values, et cetera. You should know what you're invested in.
Erica?
And check back often because it changes.
That's a great point. So I just want to spend the last couple of minutes, and again, if people have ongoing questions, they are totally welcome to email us directly after this, and we will absolutely get back to you. We're also going to be sending out an email with the recording and some of the key takeaways from this panel. So I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on what we've learned today. And Hadassah, so you talked a little bit about this analogy about the cupcake, birthday cake, celebration cake. And so I think it would be really nice if, and I guess everyone has to use the Q&A module to do this, if people who are attendees and our panelists too, could just take a moment to think about some cupcake actions that they can walk away with today. So like some examples could be like, I am going to just read what's in one of my mutual funds, or like, I am going to figure out like who my credit card is through. Just some really small actions that people feel like they could literally do this afternoon that would move them towards the values that they want to reflect in their money. I'm going to do this too.
People like one more slice of framework here. So I also spend my days as an innovation facilitator. So it can be really easy to think like, oh man, we've got to do everything and we have to make the biggest swing change and have to be ready to move all of our accounts. But I think everybody on this call has said in a couple of different ways, build yourself up towards that. So I want to give us this framework of like, a cupcake is something you can make in an afternoon, you know, like while you're like watching some TV or listening to a podcast. Celebration cake or a birthday cake is something that you would do once a year, maybe like a big audit. And a celebration cake is like the type of analysis of your finances that you might do once or twice in your lifetime. So I don't want us thinking like once or twice in a lifetime size activities. I want to scale you back to maybe this like once a year activity, like doing that audit list of all of your finances and starting to like knock some of those bigger moving your 401ks around type activities, or even, and this is what Sophie's asking us to do, scale it back even further. Think about something you could do in an afternoon, something that you could look up, something that you could open, right? What can you do in 45 minutes that you could, you know, bake a cupcake in? So that's my invitation. What's a financial thing you might try in that super small time frame? So with that, let's make our list.
Awesome. We have some really good ones. I loved what a couple of participants said. Investigate one company I'm invested in, see if I need to make a change, look at where my retirement money is actually going instead of blindly trusting a financial advisor. You know, I think in that vein, financial advisors, a lot of them are aware of sort of values-based investing, and a lot of them do not actively work a lot with that, and so sometimes need to be pushed by their clients. And I think that's an awesome thing to do, because if you can get them on board, then they might also get their other clients on board, and that's where you can sort of see that ripple effect of your impact. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to all the panelists. This was so wonderful and such a just affirming and awesome conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. This was really just such a fun conversation to have, and we appreciated all of the questions. Please stay in touch with us. Again, we will send out our contact information, so you're welcome to reach out to any of us at any time. We'd love if you followed all of our work and just stayed in touch with us, you know, personally, professionally. And we will also send out this recording so that you can send it to all your family and friends who also have these questions about their money. So thank you so much again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And don't forget to eat your cupcake this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.